The fact that Columbus Day is a federal holiday and June 19th, Juneteenth today is not, tells you a lot about the kind of history we choose as a nation to glorify and the facts we choose to ignore in our history. I want to talk about Juneteenth today. Solana Rice is the co-director of an organization called Liberation in a Generation Action. Solana, are you there? Please join me. There you are.
Hi, Bob.
How are you?
I'm
Happy
pretty, yeah, thank you. I'm pretty good.
Pretty good is not as good as you need to be. But here's the question for you. I mean, I want to start with just Donald Trump. I hate to start with Donald Trump, but I want to start with Donald Trump only in this sense. That Donald Trump has chosen, or originally chose today, to have his first major rally of this campaign. And then when there was pushback, he moved it to tomorrow, but it's still in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Was this just sort of by accident? Or was this sort of, this is what's called a rhetorical question, because you know the answer and I know the answer. But what do you think?
Absolutely strategic, absolutely just awful and infuriating. And I have to tell you, I have been to Tulsa, and in my work, I was working across the country, visiting many places. And I was at the site, it was at Greenwood, where there are plaques now and memorials, and there are photos and murals of the faces and the lives that were destroyed. And not ironically, I was there to give a presentation about the building of wealth for Black and Brown people. And so in that moment when I heard about this rally, I just knew, you know what this is about. This is another dig into trying to make sure that we know as Black people who's really in charge, but we know that we have more power, and we know that a rally is not going to tear down this holiday. Today, I say that I'm just okay because, yeah, it's a lot of complicated feelings, but I will say, and I'll tell you, that I woke up today saying, you know what, it's a blessing to have to be forced to find freedom within. When the country doesn't give you freedom, when your neighbors don't give you freedom, when you can't do simple things without finding that freedom, you often have to look within. And so that's what I'm grappling with today, is that real reality that, I'm a birder. I can't necessarily go out and bird safely all the time. I grapple with that feeling. But at the same time, you know what? I wouldn't trade it for anything. That it is a blessing to be forced to find my freedom and define my freedom within.
A blessing in the sense that you don't take freedom for granted. Black people in this country do not take freedom for granted. A lot of white people in this country presumably do take freedom for granted. And historically, I mean, Solana, I'm embarrassed to say that when I was growing up and I went to school and we studied American history, not only did I not know anything about Juneteenth, and nor did I know anything about Tulsa and 1921. And the mass killings in Tulsa in 1921 of Black people. I mean, I knew something about Columbus and Columbus Day, and I knew about that history. I mean, history itself, a nation is sort of marked by the history that it knows and it celebrates, and the facts also that it ignores. And as a white person, I am amazed at how little I was taught. As a Black girl growing up where you did, in the was it the Midwest?
Yeah.
Were you taught about Juneteenth and also about Tulsa in 1921?
I definitely was not taught about Tulsa. I did know of Juneteenth, but I'll be honest with you. I knew Black people that celebrated Juneteenth, but I didn't quite get it. It wasn't a huge holiday growing up outside of Cleveland, Ohio, at least for me. So, I want to be clear that, we have to give ourselves some grace around knowing all the history. I do think we have to do better, obviously, as an entire country about telling the history of of all the people in our country, especially Native American people and Black people and Latinx people and immigrants. But we should also give graces that we should be curious and that we should continue to seek out this information. But even, I have to wake up some days and I'm like, you know what, I'm not going to know everything. But I think it's the job of everyone to seek out that information. If we get any inkling about it, and really study it, but also to learn where we need to go and using that information to figure out where we need to go from there.
Past is prologue. But before we get into the prologue and where we need to go, I just want to, one thing that I did not know about Juneteenth is that it was 2 years after emancipation. And why did it take so long? What happened in those 2 years? In other words, why did Black people in Texas, I think this is where actually Juneteenth dates from, why did it take them 2 years, or at least white people 2 years, to tell Black people that they were emancipated? What happened in those 2 years?
Yeah, there's speculation, right? So there's speculation that, it just, the memo didn't reach Texas back then, there wasn't an internet. There's also speculation that, of course, it reached Texas. The white people that were enslaving people just decided that they didn't need to follow those orders, right? And so, it's not until you get the generals coming in and saying and declaring, like, no, these folks are now free, and enforcing the issue, do you actually get actual freedom? But we can't underscore enough that it was freedom on paper, that it was freedom that was communicated across the land. But Jim Crow laws soon followed, Black codes soon followed, and we can easily see that the disparities that we have in our economy today and socially today are very much rooted in that original history.
So those 2 years are sort of a metaphor for what's happened following. That is, you can put things on paper. You can have a Civil Rights Act. You can have a Supreme Court declaring that separate is not equal. You can have a Voting Rights Act. You can do all kinds of things, a Fair Housing Act. But if they're just on paper, if they're not actually enforced and lived, and if the powers that be are not going to actually make them real, then they're not even worth the paper they're written on.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think that's the stamina that we need to develop as a progressive movement. I was talking to some folks in Oregon a couple of years ago, and Oregon has many great bills on the books that help, in theory, build the wealth of low-income people and people of color. But when I talk to the advocates there, they say, yeah, those are on the books. We don't see the dollars in our communities, right? And so I think that's a really important thing to note, that as we're out in the streets, we're calling for big demands. Those big demands then need to translate to actual legislation. And then our work continues, actually. That's actually when our work starts, right? Is if we get that legislation, fantastic. But how do we make sure there's enforcement? How do we make sure that there's data and tracking of actual dollars flowing? How do we know when those dollars are flowing, what they are doing? And we have these examples over and over again, not only at the federal level, but at the local level. So it takes a lot of, this work takes a lot of stamina. We have to do a lot of sort of handing over the baton. It's a relay, really.
Well, it's stamina, but it also is all about power. I mean, last year, a big report was issued showing that banks, big banks in the United States, charge more on mortgages to Black people than to white people, are much more reluctant to provide mortgages to Black people than to white people. I mean, it's another form of redlining, and it's going on all the time, and presumably it's still going on. And if you're talking about Black wealth and white wealth and the wealth gap, and the wealth gap keeps growing, you just start with the big banks. But how do you actually get to the big banks if you don't have power? This is where I get hung up, as a white man, an older white man, trying to figure out what I can do to be an ally. How do we change the power dynamic?
Yeah. Well, I think it requires a couple of things. I think first we have to get policies that are really strong and actually that are more sticks than carrots at this point. In that last tax relief bill, and even in our response to coronavirus and COVID-19, we said, oh, we really trust these big corporations to come through for us yet again. So those are the kinds of things that just drive me bananas, because we keep doing the same thing and expecting a different outcome. The corporations are not going to save us. So it is about having stronger regulations, and that is about having the power of people to actually move these legislators, right? And we've got to have strong policy. We've got to have the people behind us, and we've got to be able to say, if you're not down for these big policies that actually rein in corporate power, that create a better democracy, that protect our vote, then we've got somebody else. We've got an alternative. Primaries are real things, and we have a pipeline. So I think it's these three things coming together. But you mentioned a really great example about how this economy is really racialized, and how what we talk about is a dual financial system. And I know just a couple of weeks ago, we talked a little bit about racial capitalism for a new edition of The Forge that just came out just a couple of hours ago, actually, focused on racial capitalism. It was really great to see you and chat with you for that. I want to know, what do you think about racial capitalism right now in this moment?
Well, it's a reality, and I think that, as you said, the first step is understanding it, but the next step is changing the power structure so that it can change. I mean, the frustration is that I'm old enough, let's put it that way. I'm old enough that I've seen a lot of lip service paid over the years to changing the power structure and to providing Black people with more opportunities. I lived through the civil rights movement and also the Office of Equal Opportunity and all of the Great Society. I lived through the Fair Housing Act. I saw a lot of not only politicians, but a lot of corporations saying, oh, yes, we will change our policies. We will change our practices. We will make this country really an opportunity society for Black people and for brown people. And frankly, Solana, over the last 50 years, what have we had? We've had just the opposite. I mean, we've had the criminalization of drugs. We've had the extraordinary mass incarceration. 2.5 million people are behind bars, disproportionately Black and brown. We've had police brutality, huge increases in police budgets, not to protect Black people, but really very often to harass and intimidate and imprison Black people. 50 years has been what? What have we accomplished? We're actually way behind where we were when I was 22 years old. So you can understand, as an ally of Black people, how frustrating it is for me. And when you say to me, what can we do? I have to say to you back, well, it is about power, and it is about holding people's feet to the fire. You mentioned just a moment ago the primaries, and you said alternatives. I think the biggest thing that has happened, probably most important, is that South Carolina primary in the Democratic Party, because that changed everything. That suddenly made a reality out of the power of the Black vote. And yes, George Floyd and the extraordinary, horrendous number of killings of Black people by the police are preeminent in people's minds. But if we don't talk about actually power and what changes politicians' views, we are missing the boat, I think.
I think you're absolutely right. And I am concerned about the conversation that the Democratic Party is having about this VP pick. We saw Amy Klobuchar drop out and say this, the pick should be a woman of color. I think that's fantastic lip service. But, I actually want a VP that has some experience, knows how to wield the power of the office in service of Black people, of Latinx people, of Asian, Pacific Islander, Indigenous people. I'm less concerned about the skin color. I'm more concerned about the content, about the power that person wields, about the ways that they can navigate the system that is DC. And I want that person to be able to look out for the best interests and really deliver in the best interests of people of color and Black people in particular. And I don't presume to know who that is, but that's the array of characteristics that I want to see vetted, right? Who not just like who's going to bring out the Black people, who's going to bring out the Latinx vote. I'll tell you, it's someone that can speak directly to people about their experience, about how much they are willing to go to the mat and really use their power and take risks for Black and Latinx people.
Well, I don't want to get too far off the major subject, which is Juneteenth, and
Yeah.
I don't want to get into gossip, but I do want to ask you, of the Black women who are out there and potential vice presidents, do you have a favorite?
I don't have a favorite. I follow Stacey Abrams. Kamala Harris is also, obviously she's from California. I have a history of following what she has been doing. I don't have a favorite though, because I'm really waiting to see like what these candidates are going to say, what the people that are being vetted are going to say, and what their policy stances are going to be. Are they actually going to be able to pull the Biden campaign in a direction that speaks to Black people? That's what I'm most interested in. So I don't have a favorite.
Well, I'm tempted to ask you about Michelle Obama as a possible candidate, but I'm not going to go there. I'm going to ask you what you
really want Michelle. You really
No. I want to go a little bit deeper into what you just said about the vice president and the role of the vice president in terms of not just getting more Black people to the polls, assuming that it is going to be a Black vice president, but in terms of representing the interests and speaking to Black people. We did have a Black president. And that Black president, some people think, went out of his way not to be a Black president in terms of not inspiring fear and a backlash among white people. So do you really want to have a Black woman vice president who is, quote unquote, representing Black people or people of color in the United States? Is that a good thing? Or would that put too much kind of almost responsibility on her shoulders?
Look, I know that this VP is going to have to do a lot of work, right? This is not going to be just a sideshow. Whoever this VP is going to have to do a lot of work. I am looking for where the VP is sitting in terms of policy. We have major issues to combat as Black people. I think what people need to, what I keep thinking about is the fact that we are at the point where we're like, defund the police, right? We did not think that we would be at this moment really on the precipice of defunding the police. But there are people that have been calling for it for decades, right? And now we are realizing that, yep, we need to defund the police. And what I am looking for is a VP that can say, you know what? We want an alternative to policing. We want huge community investments. We've heard groups from across the country, Movement for Black Lives, Dream Defenders, BYP 100, all calling to do defunding the police and investing in community investments instead. And I will say, I think we're seeing gateways into what I think should be guarantees. And that's what I want to hear out of a VP. Whether they are representing Black, I don't think it's anybody needs to be representing Black people. I think we need to be representing the interests of Black people.
Solana,
and that is a real stake.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I hope I didn't interrupt you, but I did want to ask you what community investment is a term that is batted around a lot. What does it actually mean to you?
Yeah, for me, it means that all people of color are finding safety and security. So we all will have a place to live that is affordable, that is safe, that is secure. I'm really inspired by the work of People's Action to forward a homes guarantee in that regard, right? For me, I think we've got to think about a basic income. This is a idea that's as old as the Black Panther Party, as old as FDR even. Have called for basic income and a guaranteed job. If you want a job, you can get a job. I mean, I think these aren't cheap. I mean, we've said this before, but these are expensive investments, and they are what we need to do. Of course, there's a guarantee to health care. Of course, there's this idea of, abolishing college and making college an endeavor that you can do without incurring tons and tons of debt. And I actually think there's one more thing that we don't talk enough about, which is guaranteeing some modicum of wealth for young people that are born in this country. So, our friend Derek Hamilton and many others are calling for a policy called baby bonds, where everyone is endowed with a modicum of savings to use at a later point in life for building that wealth. And I think, these are the structures that need to be in place. And people often ask me about reparations. I feel like absolutely reparations need to happen. I want them on top of all of these other things.
But some of those things that you just mentioned, I mean, affordable housing and a basic income and a job guarantee, those presumably are things that a lot of people, poor people, lower working class people in this country need, regardless of their race. Reparations, though, is something slightly different. And how do you speak to a lower middle class or poor white person in terms of all of this? When you say community investment, what do you say? You're part of this, or do you say no? You really can't be part of this because we Black people are the ones who really have suffered the legacy of slavery.
Well, the first thing that I always say is this person doesn't often get a fair audience with poor white folks. So I don't feel like I'm the one to be the messenger to poor white folks. But there is a lot of debate about whether or not these should be universal programs. I do think that there is an element of universality that we can consider in a lot of these programs. At the same time, there are ways to target and make sure that Black and Brown folks and people that are low wealth. I mean, that's what I want to underscore. In this nation, a Black person with a college education has less wealth than a white person who is a high school dropout. So at some point, we have to recognize that there are going to have to be investments that disproportionately benefit Black people. And I think that's the policy conversation that we want to have with a lot of other groups about how do you get to that disproportionate benefit while still maintaining that there are many people that need support. There are many white people that need support. But I would say if we start with investing in Black people, if we start with investing in low wealth people, Indigenous people, Latinx people, that's a fine place to start. It doesn't mean it is the place that we end, but it is a fine place to start.
It's a place to start, and and we are going to have to end very, very soon. But I would just want to pursue that one point with you, Solana, because it's interesting. I mean, almost all the wealth of this country is at the very top. If you're in the bottom 80%, you got almost nothing. I mean, if you are, it doesn't matter what race you are. I mean, the top 1% has about 45% of the nation's wealth. The top 10% has about almost 90% of the nation's wealth. You got 3 people at the very top who have a disproportionate amount of total wealth. So I guess my question to you is if you start, and I don't mean to be a devil's advocate, but I do mean to be a devil's advocate. If you start with Black people and build up their wealth, which I think is extraordinarily important, how do you deal with this overwhelmingly kind of disproportionate top heaviness of the system of wealth in this country, which hasn't been this top heavy and this concentrated at the top since 1890?
Yeah, it is absolutely why we say that we have to both build a liberation economy, which is about building wealth, about providing housing, about providing jobs. But we also have to dismantle systems of oppression, because what you are talking about is a clear example of a system of oppression. When companies can hoard wealth, when individuals can hoard wealth, that limits the choice, the freedom, the mobility of people of color directly, especially Black people. And it puts us in harm's way time and time again. So, for example, Black people are more likely to be essential workers right now. Guess who don't have protections as workers, as essential workers? Black people, right? So, and this is in large part due because we didn't want to make the investments in protecting or holding corporations accountable for making the investments to protect workers when we have the chance to do these relief packages, right? So, I think we have to be looking at both sides every time. We can't just say, oh, we're building opportunity, we're investing. Meanwhile, there are corporations draining the wealth of people of color and Black people consistently with the other hand. There's always another side, and we have to be strategic in our power building to acknowledge both of those sides.
Well, Solana Rice, I am 100%, 1,000% behind you. And I want to do personally whatever I can, not only to make your own mission succeed, but also to make sure that we are the kind of society that we want to be, we should be, we committed to be, but we never have been. Solana Rice, thanks for joining me, and also happy Juneteenth.
Yes, thank you, Bob. And I just want to say, following the leadership of Black people is a fine place to start as well. Movement for Black Lives is having a series of actions this weekend. The Poor People's Campaign is also having an action tomorrow. The Dream Defenders, check them out. They've got a great analysis about the community investments we need. I'm feeling really held and in solidarity with so many people across the country. So thank you, and thanks for this opportunity and this platform.
Okay, talk to you soon.